Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to talk about some deep sea scary stuff and horror stories. So if you don't like deep sea horror stuff, please skip ahead to another video I have created. And thank you. Let's begin. The Byford dolphin accident is one of the most major deep sea accidents to ever happen. This incident took place in 1983 on the Byford Dolphin, a drilling rig that was operated in the Northern Sea. It happened like this. On a normal day of work, two divers climbed into the rig's diving bell, a transportation chamber to take them down to a depth before heading to the chamber system for below the surface. At first, all seemed to go well, with the divers taking turns resting and heading out to work on the rig. On a fatal day during their time underwater, however, two divers were resting in their decompression chamber, while another two divers made their way to the chambers into the diving bell. Everything was going as planned, as the two tenders, the divers, secured the bell to the chambers. The two divers on board would soon process their own comprehension of the chamber itself. However, as the tenders were preparing to depart, they failed to seal off the diving bell properly from the chambers before beginning their ascent. What ensued was that the chambers were suddenly decompressed from 9 atmospheres to 1 atmosphere. The air rushed out of the chamber. Tragically, 3 of the divers inside the chambers at the time were killed in the horrible way through explosive decompression. Essentially, the nitrogen bubbles in their blood expanded, causing them to boil from the inside out. The 4th was sucked out of a very narrow opening, injecting his internal organs for the sake of disgustingness. One of the divers in the bell was also killed in the incident as well. The Wildrake accident took place in August 1979 on an oil rig in the North Sea. During this dive, 2 commercial divers, American Richard Walker and Victor Gould, climbed into a dive bell aboard the MS Wildrake, a support vessel on the oil rig. Unfortunately, the diving bells became separated from the lift wire and was used to lower it to pull it up while the bell was at a depth of 525 feet. That meant that there was no electricity or heated supply to the diving bell. The oil rig company did its best to rescue the 2 divers who were inside, but their attempts would take nearly 24 hours to get it accomplished. In that time, the fate of the 2 divers in the bell was sealed. By the time the rig managed to pull the diving bell back to the surface, the pair of the divers passed away due to hypothermia, unfortunately. Not all diving accidents have occurred in the Northern Sea, thankfully. One nasty deep sea diving accident occurred in 2017 off the northern shore of Australia and was run by a company called Dolph Subsea Australia. In this particular accident, Dolph Subsea Australia sent several divers down to about 885 feet down to work on an underwater pipeline. This was actually one of the deepest saturation divers in Australian waters, which meant that it was a pretty big deal. Unfortunately, it seems that the company didn't seem that this dive was a big deal itself. They failed to give the divers the proper gases needed to work at those depths. When the divers returned to the surface, they began complaining of hallucination, tremors, and brain issues, stating that they'd even noticed these symptoms setting in while they were on the ocean floor. Upon further investigation, it turned out that the divers were suffering from high-pressure nervous syndrome, which takes place due to divers breathing helium at deep depths. While the symptoms were reversible, and the divers didn't suffer any permanent health issues, Dolph Subsea Australia was court-ordered to pay their negligence. Good job, Australia. The Drillmaster accident occurred in 1974 in Norway and was a tragedy in itself and wound up costing 2 commercial divers their lives. In this particular accident, the 2 divers in question, Perce Skamnes and Robert Smith, was getting ready to work on a rig called the Drillmaster. While inside the diving bell at a depth of 321 feet, the drop weight on the bell malfunctioned and was released. This caused the diving bell to go shooting up to the surface. Now, it would have been bad enough if this all just happened. However, the bottom door of the diving bell was opened at the time. This meant that when the rig shot up to the surface, the pressure in it changed rapidly. Both divers wound up dying due to decompression, sickness, and drowning, unfortunately. So if you're wanting to get into the diving business, I would think ahead of time. The Star Canopus accident took place in Scotland in 1978 and was part of a routine dive alongside the Barrel Alpha platform out of the North Sea. On this particular dive, the two divers named Lauren Ward and Gerald Prongley climbed into the diving bell to head down for a routine dive. Unfortunately, the drop wire, life support, and guide wires were all severed by a loose anchor. Instead of slowly lowering the diving bell to the depth, the bell plunged down to a depth of 328 feet. A rescue mission was launched, and more than 13 hours later, the two divers were finally recovered. Tragically, by that time, they had both passed due to drowning and hypothermia. I'm not sure which one came first, but I'm guessing hypothermia and then drowning, but who knows. The Stena Seaport accident took place in the North Sea. In 1981, during this accident, two divers named Phil Robertson and Jim Tucker were more than 100 meters below the ocean surface in an ocean bell, having just completed work on the oil rig. Although all seemed to have gone well, what the team didn't know was that strong tides had damaged the umbilical cords to the bell, which meant that the diving bell was no longer receiving air pressure. Of course, as soon as the surface team realized that this had happened, they seemed to have launched rescue operations. They began pulling the diving bell up to the surface. However, they realized that the bell had no pressure and that the divers were at risk of decompression sickness. The rescue team, thinking fast, lowered a second dive bell to the diver's depth, and rescue divers helped move the two men from the broken bell into a new one. The rescue was a successful one, and all parties involved made it back to the surface unharmed. Yay! I would say to whoever wants to go diving, don't go into the North Sea. Part of another seemingly routine dive, the Ventura 1 diving accident took place in 1977, in the North Sea, of course. In this particular accident, two divers named Dave Hammond and Craig Hoffman were set to lower a blowout of 525 feet down for the Venture 1 drilling rig. As part of the operation, the divers had to cut several loose wires as a blowout preventer. Hoffman waited in a chamber in the diving bell while Hammond went out to work onto the rig. It was while Hammond was working on the rig that a strange electrical sound was heard over the communication radio. That's always a good sign when you hear an eerie sound while you're working in a tremendous state. Hammond rushed back to the diving bell to check on his diving partner, only to find him floating unconscious outside the diving bell. Hammond pulled Hoffman back into the bell, and after doing his best to resuscitate him, it was finally declared that Hoffman had died. Both men were brought to the surface, and an investigation showed that Hoffman had died by drowning. It's thought that he fell out of the diving bell with his mask off, inhaled water, and died, as you do when you take off your mask in underwater situations. Anyway, the Wedge Drill 2nd accident took place in 1975 when two divers named Robert Edwin and Peter Holmes were working in, of course, you guessed it, the North Sea, off the coast of Scotland. On this dive, the two divers headed down to about 394 feet to do a short dive, untangled some rope along the rig. After completing the job, the two divers headed back to the diving bell to decompress. As they were sealing off in the bell, however, they noticed a gas leak. Despite their best efforts, they weren't able to put a stop to the leak and were forced to move into a deep chamber attached to the bell. This is where things started to go crazy. Their supervisor, who was outside the chamber, began feeding helium into it to seal off from the gas leak. However, because the gauge inside the chamber wasn't working, he didn't realize he overcompensated and sent too much helium into the chamber. This caused the inside pressure to drop to a depth of 650 feet, the temperature to rise to a whopping 120 degrees, or 48 degrees Celsius. The two men inside the chamber were unable to breathe properly as the temperature grew highly amounts. After a few hours, they died of hypothermia. Another tale of fun times. The Bibi Topaz is a more recent diving accident that occurred in 2012. In this awful accident, the diver named Chris Lamons on a subsea diving drilling structure with the support of a vessel named Bibi Topaz. However, while Chris was underwater, the Bibi Topaz positioning system malfunctioned, and it drifted 625 feet off the course. The good news is that Chris managed to get out of the underwater structure safely, but he could await rescue. However, in the process, he snagged his umbilical cord support system. The cord was providing him with air and hot water and communications. That left the terrified diver trapped on the seafloor in total darkness. The good news is that back on the surface, the Bibi Topaz managed to regain their position and implement realization of what was happening. After just 40 minutes on the seafloor, they managed to pull Chris back to his diving bell and get him the medical help that he was needing. Chris thankfully survived the situation. Bibi Topaz has made efforts to improve safety for its divers as well. Good job. Another one. The John C. Link accident took place in 1973. What happened is that in a submersible named the John C. Link was sent down off the coast of Key West to help us sink an artificial reef in the area. There were two divers aboard the vessel, Edwin Link and Albert Stover, as a pilot of the submersible, who were meant to check out conditions of the reef below. However, while under the water of submersible type scenarios, it got trapped into a wreckage of a very destroyer it was supposed to be monitoring. Rescue efforts were launched immediately and eventually it was recovered. While the pilot of the ship made it to the surface alive, both divers had passed due to carbon dioxide poisoning. What do you think of these scenarios? Would you go down diving into the deep blue ocean? I certainly would not. Thank you and have a great one. Bye.